Well, hi everyone, and thanks for coming back. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about the selection of controls in a case control study. Now remember the way we're describing case control studies. What we're going to do is we're going to enroll people, cases, people with disease. We're going to enroll another group of people, controls. And what we're going to do for both groups is we're going to ask about previous histories of exposure. How much smoking these people did in the past. So for example, let's use again the Framingham Heart Study in the examples we've been talking about. Smoking and either the impact of smoking on overall mortality or the impact of smoking on coronary heart disease. But now talk about case control studies. In a case control study, we're going to enroll cases, people who already have the disease, people who have already developed, for example, coronary heart disease. We're going to ask them about their previous smoking histories. How much smoking did you do in the past? And we're going to enroll another group of people called controls. And remember, what we've said so far is the whole purpose of the controls is to describe how common the exposure smoking was in the cohort study that existed in the past, that if you created that cohort study and followed it into the future, the outcomes of that cohort study would have been the cases in this case control study. So the controls are reflecting the source population of the cases that you now have in your case control study. Okay, so let's talk about these underlying cohort studies that in our mind existed in the past. In the past, they were followed forwards in time to see who developed heart disease and who didn't develop heart disease. When we talked about cohort studies, we talked about two different types of cohort studies. We talked about closed cohort studies. We talked about open cohort studies. Remember, a closed cohort study was a group of people, all of which are designed to be followed for a fixed period of time. There are no losses to follow-up. So at the end of the follow-up, you can say with complete certitude whether a person did or did not develop the outcome. So for example, we've been using, as an example, smoking as an exposure and its impact on overall mortality, death. Using the Framingham data set, we've been measuring the incidence of death among the smokers, the incidence of death among non-smokers, taking into account that we had no losses to follow up. We could measure from such a closed cohort study, we could measure the cumulative incidence, the estimated risk of death among smokers and non-smokers, and estimate a risk ratio, or if we want, we could take into account how much person time all the smokers and all the non-smokers contributed, either until the study ended or until they developed coronary heart disease. We could measure incidence rates, and we can measure incidence rate ratios. So you can do either with cohort studies if they're closed cohort studies. For an open cohort study, we talked about that happens when you have a dynamic population, people coming and leaving, people follow for different periods of time, or maybe you have different periods of follow-up due to losses to follow-up in a study that was designed to be a closed cohort study to begin with, but failed to be a closed cohort because of these losses. Either way, what do we measure? We measure incidence rates. So we use, for example, the relationship between smoking and coronary heart disease in the Framingham data set to address that particular type of open cohort study. Now think about the case control studies. We're thinking about these underlying populations, the population that gave rise to these cases. We have these women with breast cancer in our case control study. We're trying to imagine the cohort study that they would have come out of. The source population is that cohort study. We want to know how much oral contraceptive use was in that underlying cohort study. That's what the controls are trying to tell you. They're trying to estimate how much exposure, oral contraceptive use, existed in this source population, in this cohort study that exists in our mind, that no one ever did, perhaps, but we do know the outcomes of that cohort study. They are the cases. They were the women with breast cancer in our case control study. That's the setting of the selection of the controls. So how are we going to select controls? We're going to be talking about in this series of lectures is two different main ways of selecting controls. If in our mind the underlying cohort study was closed, there were fixed numbers of people, they were followed for a fixed period of time, no losses to follow up, some people became diseased, some people didn't become diseased, there are two options in this closed cohort design in our mind for me to select my controls. I can do something called a nested case control study, and that's what I'm going to be talking about in the next lecture. I can select as my controls the people who did not develop the disease. the non-diseased people, the old definition of case control studies. I can take a sample of those people who lived through the closed cohort, were followed to the end of the study, and didn't develop the disease. And that's one option I could have. Another option is, since the controls are supposed to reflect the full cohort, I could select the controls from members of the original cohort study. That's an example of something called a case cohort study, which I'll also describe in less detail in the coming lecture. So if you have a closed cohort study in mind, there are two ways you can select your controls. Either from the group of people who went through the cohort study and did not develop the disease, and that's going to lead you to what is known as the nested case control study, or you can select them from people at the very beginning of your cohort. And that's going to lead you to something called a case cohort study. And I'll try to give you more of a feel for those two selection implications in a future lecture. Now, alternatively, if in our minds we have an open cohort as the cohort study that gave rise to the women who are cases in our case control study. The women are these cases of newly diagnosed breast cancer from our one hospital. We're trying to imagine what's the cohort study, if it were followed over time, would have given me those women as the outcomes in that cohort study. Well, chances are the cohort would have been open. People move in and move out of the geographical region that's served by that hospital. People are followed for different periods of time. I would have been measuring incidence rates if I did the cohort study. So now I'm talking about selecting controls using something called incidence rate sampling. And there are two types of case control study designs that I want to talk under that particular setting. One is going to be called the density type case control study. It's the most common case control study that was done in the past. The controls are being selected from that open cohort that's in our minds that existed in the past. So the chances of someone being selected as control should reflect how much person time that person was contributing in that previously done cohort study that exists in our mind. Alternative, we can do something called risk set sampling to select our controls. And now we're selecting controls from the risk group that existed at the time a person became a disease. So we're looking at each of our cases, determining the time they developed the disease, and we're trying to measure who else in that underlying open cohort study existed at that time and could have been selected as a case if they developed their outcome at that same time that the case did. So in some sense, we are matching on follow-up time. And that leads us to another sampling design known as risk set sampling. I'll say a little bit about that also. So those are the different, at least four of the different study design options I want to talk about in the terms of the selection of controls for a case control study. I want to spend most of my time talking about the nested case control study for the first case when I had a closed cohort in my mind, and the density type case control study for the second type where I have an open cohort in my mind as the source population for my cases. But I'll say a little bit about case cohort studies and a little bit about risk set sampling also. So we'll do those in the future lectures, and I'll see you then.